the year 2019, a little girl writes a letter in which she describes how she will never change and will not grow up, which she can no longer bear. She leaves the house to watch the sunrise, and when she looks up, we see her yellow eyes. She's a vampire. As soon as the sun rises, her whole body burns up. Then we are shown that the world is emptying during the day because of an epidemic caused by an infected bat in 2009 year. Most of humanity has turned into vampires. The number of people is falling, and researchers are starting to look for blood substitutes to feed the vampires. And a small group of vampires are fighting for humanity, as they are hunted and raised. When night falls, the world comes alive again. We see how vampires continue to live a normal life, like people, hanging out or going to work. There is even a vampire tramp asking for blood, who threatens a random passerby. For this, the police electrocute him. Meanwhile, our main character Edward Dalton gets to work by car and then by subway. He works as a hematologist for the pharmaceutical company Bromsley Marks, which is an important blood supplier. After going through security, Edward walks past rooms with machines for growing people, which he hates. Only then he goes to his laboratory. He is working on finding a blood substitute, but his last attempt is unsuccessful. After that, he meets with his boss Charles Bromley and the army officers. The commissioner informs them about the results of the experiment they conducted on a prisoner sentenced to death. He was chosen to investigate the effects of blood deprivation. Lack of blood caused complete degeneration of the frontal lobe of the brain. The first signs of this were elongated ears. He quickly turned into a monster-like creature, devoid of rationality and emotion. Such creatures are called subsidizers, and they become a problem on the streets. There are only 5% of the human population left, and if they are not replaced soon, they will all become subsidized. Bromley cuts into the conversation and leads the man to his office for a personal meeting, where Edward ignores the coffee served to him with blood, and Bromley tells him his story. He used to have cancer, but vampirism cured him. However, his daughter did not want to apply and ran away. He knows that Edward feels sorry for people just like himself. That is why they need to start the test as soon as possible in order to save humanity. Edward goes to his lab and discusses this with Christopher, who, after some hesitation, notes that the substitute works on a monkey. So it's time to move on from animal testing. A moment later, the researchers begin testing, while Bromley and several officers watch them through the window. Edward slowly injects the substitute into the body of the private, who at first feels fine. But as soon as the entire dose is in the body, he vomits and he begins to convulse. And nasty blisters appear all over his body. The researchers immediately resort to restraining him and inject him with a serum that really stops him shaking and makes the blisters disappear, but after a second, his whole body explodes. Later in the evening, Edward leaves the office and goes home. In the car, he watches the news, which tells about the riots associated with blood rationing schemes when scratching his ear. He notices something amiss. He opens the camera mirror and checks. His ears begin to grow in length. Distracted, he does not notice a car that is driving on the oncoming lane. At the last second, he manages to dodge and stop the car, but it crashes into a fence. Edward comes to the rescue and gets an arrow in his arm. These turn out to be people with a leader named Audrey. She has a crossbow to defend herself from vampires. Suddenly, police cars approach them, and Edward swears that he just wants to help and asks people to get into his car, to which they agree after some hesitation. Edward turns on the day protection mode in the car, as a result of which all the windows turn black, and then takes out the arrow at the moment when the police arrive. While he lies and tells in which direction the people ran away, Audrey finds the man's identification badge and learns his profession. After the police have left, the people get out of the car, and Audrey wishes Dalton a happy birthday as they run away. A moment later, Edward gets home. There is a notice hanging around the city warning everyone about the approaching sunrise. When he gets home, he has dinner and begins to take care of the plants, when suddenly his brother Frankie Dalton, whom he has not seen for several months because he went to the army, visits him. Frankie comments on the lack of a birthday celebration, to which Edward replies that he has already turned 35 10 times. Frankie doesn't care. He thinks they should celebrate, and that he brought an expensive bottle of 100% pure human blood. He pours 2 glasses, teasing his brother for drinking pig's blood, but Edward refuses. This infuriates Frankie, who starts their old sport word, does not touch human blood, but at the same time works for a company that breeds people. and he considers it a necessary evil to be able to find a replacement. At the same time, he looks down on Frankie, who hunts people for the army. Edward suddenly grabs a bottle of blood and starts pouring it down the drain. But Frankie takes it away from him and smashes it against the wall, after which he tries to leave. However, he does not succeed, because a creature gets in his way. This is a vampire who has not drunk blood for a long time. The creature enters the kitchen and begins to lick the blood from the walls, and then moves onto a glass filled with blood. Frankie grabs a knife, which scares the creature, and he throws Frankie on a glass table, and for a few seconds he loses consciousness. Then the creature moves towards Edward, but he restrains him with a stool, shouting his brother's name. Frankie regains consciousness and takes the knife. Together, the brothers try to attack the creature, but it jumps aside and hangs on the ceiling. This allows Frankie to stab him a few times, after which he beheads him. A moment later, the police arrive, commenting on the fact that the residents now live in the suburbs. One of the policemen finds a ring on the creature, and Edward realizes that it was a local gardener. She also finds self-inflicted wounds. Feeding yourself accelerates mutation. The next morning, Dalton will have an alarm. He goes to check, and when he turns on the light, he discovers that Audrey is pointing a crossbow at him. She tells him that they were looking for vampires who could be trusted, and that they need his help to find another way other than a replacement. She also gives him a piece of paper with a map. Dalton is suddenly distracted by the noise, allowing Audrey to silently leave. When he checks what the noise is, it turns out to be Frankie, who asks Dalton about the woman. Edward replies that this is not important information. Later in the evening, the news shows that investors are taking their human stocks out of Bromley. Edward goes to work and meets with his boss to ask for guarantees that a substitute will replace the need for human supplies. Bromley replies that most of the population will be happy, but a small sector will always demand real blood. Edward reminds him that Bromley's daughter is among them. How much do you think they will pay for your daughter? Then he returns to his laboratory and looks at the map. When morning comes, Edward doesn't come home. He puts a light shield on the car and goes to get a map in the countryside, where Audrey is already waiting for him, and tells him to drive up to a big tree. He parks under the shade of this tree and, wearing a hat and sunglasses, gets out of the car. Carefully trying not to get into the light, he approaches old Lionel Elvis. He was once a vampire, but now he's human. Edward wants to find out how it happened, but they are interrupted by the approaching Audrey, who is being held at gunpoint by Frankie. Edward wants to stop him, but Frankie doesn't listen to him. Army reinforcements are already arriving. Audrey pushes Frankie out into the sunlight and joins the men. They take Dalton's car because the soldiers have already opened fire and destroyed Lionel's car. On the way, they are chased and shot, punching holes in the dark protection of the car. At first, Audrey manages to cover them with her hands, but there are too many of them, and the camera also shoots out. And Edward can't see the road. Lionel gets behind the wheel to see the road through the hole. When they reach the gloomy bridge, Lionel drives as fast as possible to cross it safely. But the military truck turns out to be too heavy, and the bridge breaks under it, causing the truck to explode. The rest of the group stays behind, unable to pursue them. After nightfall, they park, and Lionel tells Edward his story. He worked on daylight modifications for cars and had one of the first workshops in the city. Driving in daylight is an amazing activity because there are no other people around. But it can be dangerous for the driver. That's exactly what happened to Lionel. He wasn't feeling well because he wasn't eating, and accidentally crashed his car into the fence. As a result of the collision, he was thrown out of the car, and he caught fire, and then fell into the river. When he emerged from the water, he became a man again. Lionel and Audrey want Edward to recreate these security conditions. Back at the company, Bromley is looking at photos of his daughter when Frankie comes to him. Bromley praises him for reporting the incident, and says that if Edward returns immediately, no formal charges will be filed. Frankie agrees to do whatever Bromley asks him to do. Meanwhile, Edward and the people return to his car and drive to their hideout. Edward can't stop looking at Audrey's neck, and when she notices this and his pointed ears, she cuts her hand and pours some blood into a cup for him to drink. He refuses at first, but Audrey needs to know that other people will be safe around him, so he accepts the cup and drinks it. A few hours later, they reach a very old vineyard, where Edward meets other people, including Jarvis, who is leading a rescue team to find more people. Entering the house, He also meets Senator Wes Turner, a vampire politician advocating for the protection of human rights and the search for a cure. After a short episode, when Bromley watches one of his machines lose all the people, and his researchers extract the body. We are shown a coffee kiosk at a metro station where a man complains that there is not enough blood in his coffee. The employee tells him that she is allowed to give out only 5%, but the man does not accept a refusal. He steals a bag of blood and, tearing it, splashes everyone around, infuriating the others. Vampires rebel and attack a coffee stall to steal more blood, resulting in the presence of the police, who electrocute them. The next morning in the vineyard, Edward takes blood from Lionel for tests and asks questions about how he felt on the day he became a man. It was as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room. Edward believes that perhaps the only chance to be cured. This is to make a controlled sunburn. A few hours later, when he leaves the lab to take a break, most people walk away from him. Audrey comes to say that they may be afraid of him, but still believe that he can help. Edward admits that he didn't want to convert, but Frankie betrayed him and turned him anyway. That's when Edward notices the fermentation tanks. And after Audrey confirms that they are airtight, they go to look at them from the inside. There are air vents in the tanks that will put out the fire, and Edward decides to use them for an experiment. So they start working on the necessary modifications. Later, in the middle of the night, we see Jarvis's group on the road taking a convoy of rescued people to the vineyard, including Bromley's daughter Allison. When they have a flat tire from a blow, they are forced to stop their cars. They get out of the car, weapons at the ready. But the army surrounds them, and after a short firefight, all the people are captured. Allison manages to contact the vineyard before she too falls unconscious. When Frankie picks up the recreation from her, they use it to track the call and find the location of the vineyard. At the vineyard, people gather their belongings and get into cars to go to the shelter. But Edward wants to stay because there will be no other chance to recreate the experiment. So Lionel and Audrey decide to stay and help too. Back in Bromley, Allison wakes up in her father's office and grabs a knife when he comes to her. Allison begs to save her friends, but Bromley says he's glad to see her, but, hugging her, admits that he can't do anything for her friends. Allison pushes him away and starts to run away, but she is knocked out by a soldier when Bromley realizes that his daughter stabbed him. When morning comes in the vineyard, the experiment is ready to start. Audrey will monitor the monitors, and Lionel will remain in the tank with Edward, who has a heart monitor connected to his chest, and who is covered with a wet blanket. The process is simple. They open a hole in the tank so that the sunlight burns Dalton. Then they use the hood to turn off the fire. The first two attempts are unsuccessful, but they allow Edward to burn long enough for the third, and this time everything works out. Edward manages to become human again. Their happiness is interrupted by the army arriving on the raid, but they avoid capture by hiding in a barrel of wine. We return to the company again when Frankie visits Bromley, who is being treated for a wound. Bromley asks Frankie to do something for him, and Frankie leaves the room to see Allison in her cell. She still doesn't want to be turned, but Frankie goes ahead and bites her anyway. Returning to the vineyard, the trio leaves the shelter, making sure that it is safe. Edward goes outside and is surprised that the sun's rays do not burn his skin, and Lionel takes out his old car. Meanwhile, at the company, Bromley sees that all of his cars are now empty. And then he checks his daughter, who does not drink her portion of blood. Bromley enters the cell and discovers that she is biting herself, which leads to her mutation. She attacks her father and blames him for everything, after which she is taken away. After martial law is imposed, so that they can freely fight the opponents on the streets, we see the trio who arrive at Turner's hut, but discover that all the people are dead. Audrey begins to lose hope, but Edward says he knows someone who can help. After a short episode, when Christopher manages to break into the laboratory, we are shown how the military pulls the subsidists out into the sunlight for execution. Allison is among them, and watching her die makes Frankie reconsider his position. Later that night, Christopher returns to his house, where the trio is waiting for him. Edward tells him that he has a drug that is better than a substitute, and asks him to help recreate the experiment. Their conversation is interrupted by a phone call, and Christopher leaves the room to answer. When he doesn't come back for too long, they get suspicious, and Audrey goes looking for him. And the guys are checking his phone. It turns out that Christopher has been leaving his phone open for a call all this time, and now everyone in the company knows where they are. Soldiers arrive unexpectedly, knocking Audrey out and taking her prisoner. But Lionel and Edward manage to escape using underground tunnels. They decide to hide in an old abandoned garage where they are attacked by a creature. When Frankie arrives, he shoots the creature, and then notices that his brother has become a man and admits that he turned him, only because he did not want to see him die. He admits that he made a mistake and now wants to help. But when Lionel gets closer, thirst takes over him, and he jumps on the man to bite him. Edward grabs him and pushes him away. He is about to shoot his brother, but a moment later, we see Edward voluntarily entering the company building, raising the alarm with his human condition. The guards catch him and take him to Bromley's office, where Audrey is bleeding on a chair and drinking her blood. Edward tells him that he regrets everything and wants to become a vampire again, upsetting Audrey with his betrayal. Bromley shows him that they have finally found a replacement, so he doesn't need Edward anymore and calls him a coward. Edward replies that Bromley is also a coward because he couldn't convert his own daughter. In a rage, Bromley bites him, but Edward doesn't mind. In fact, this was his plan from the very beginning. Bromley begins to transform into a human, and when Edward remembers how Frankie transformed, he explains that he needs to drink purified vampire blood. This is medicine. Bromley pushes the alarm button to call security, and we see a bunch of army trucks arrive at the parking lot. When the soldiers get out of the cars and approach the elevator, the doors open and show Bromley tied to a chair, from which the vampires become enraged and begin to feed on him. Meanwhile, the guys, armed with the found weapons, go down the stairs and are about to leave the building. But then they are blocked by new soldiers. The glass doors suddenly shatter when Frankie drives a car inside, knocking down all the soldiers to save his brother. But reinforcements are right there, and now they are surrounded. Frankie tells Edward to leave and then sacrifice himself, allowing all the soldiers to pounce on him and eat him. At this moment, the guard captures Audrey. He follows them to the security room, where, after some struggle, Edward manages to kill 2 vampire guards and help Audrey kill the third. Then they watch on surveillance cameras as the soldiers who fed on Frankie become human, and other vampire soldiers now attack them as well. There is a massacre, and by the time Edward and Audrey return to the hall, only a handful of human soldiers remain. Christopher appears and shoots several soldiers, claiming that there can be no cure. He is about to shoot the guys when suddenly an arrow hits his chest and kills him. This is the arrow of Laenula, who came to the rescue. Audrey hugs him, and Edward looks at his brother's body at the moment when the light of the rising sun slowly makes its way inside. The film ends with the trio leaving in Lionel's car, and Edward tells us that now they have the drugs and they can change everyone back. It's not too late to fix it.